Hello, and welcome to Prism. Prism is a design-oriented podcast hosted by me, Dan Hardin. Like a glass prism that reveals the color hidden inside white light, this podcast will reveal the inside story behind innovation, especially the people that make it happen. My aim is to uncover each guest's unique point of view, their insights, their methods, or their own secret motivator, perhaps, that fuels their creative genius.
So my name's Courtney and I am in materials and finish, colored material finish. My background is coming out of Logitech for the past 10 years. And then for the last 2, been doing my own consulting practice under Bright Studio. And lately been focused in the electrified RV space. So working with Lightship, which is a SF-based and Colorado-based startup.
Great. So my name is Mike Elam. I'm Director of Technical Strategy here at Whipsaw. My interest in sustainability and the circular economy, I think, started probably about 15 years ago or so. And really what got me on this track was trying to repair a Smeg refrigerator that I'd bought and trying to figure out how to replace the seal, and then finding out that the only way to replace the door seal was to buy an entire new door. And then I started to research planned obsolescence and things like that, and then got involved with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation for a bit in the UK, but then moved over here to the US about 11 years ago with great plans to start a consultancy in this space, and then realized that unfortunately at that point nobody in the US really knew what I was talking about. So I moved on, but it's great to be talking about all these things again because it's something I've been passionate about for a long time.
Do you feel like coming then and then feeling there was no audience? Do you feel like the audience is very now, or do you feel like it's been kind of like ramping over a certain amount of time?
I think it's kind of grown exponentially over the last 2 years, really, 2, maybe 3 years. It's suddenly picked up. I think there's been this kind of slow groundswell kind of bubbling up, but really, I mean, I've still had many conversations with people relatively recently where there's still been, blank faces staring back. So it's great that there's so much interest. And there's now so much legislation coming in as well that's forcing behaviors, which is also important.
Yeah. I would say when I was at Logitech, I think the conversation was zero for many, many years. And then it did seem probably a year or 2 pre-pandemic. Yeah. It started to be kind of a concern, but kind of like, oh, we don't know what to do. Yeah. And the fire really got lit right around pandemic, and a lot more time and resource went into kind of trying to figure everything out as quickly as possible. I think it's interesting now when you talk to students who are, finishing school or freshly out, they take courses, that try to at least kind of skim the surface of sustainability and circularity. But maybe to touch on like the blank faces still, I think a lot of times they come back to me and tell me like they're trying to carry that practice forward into their first jobs, and they find it very frustrating because I think they get kind of that response.
Yeah. I'm curious. When things started when focus shifted in Logitech, was that at all legislation driven, or was that more just kind of consumer insights and just the feeling like that was the way it was going?
Hard to say. I don't feel like there was a lot of conversation. I was definitely, bottom feeding at that time. So maybe there was more conversation like way above about legislation. But I think actually what pushed maybe the first couple projects that really went to fruition was regulations in China. So it wasn't even EU or the United States that was really regulating quite as much, but it's like something changed in China, and very suddenly there was a panic, and like we need to change, switch out a couple of formulas, that we're using, and it hadn't been a topic really before. It was just kind of like very altruistic. I was like, oh, we'll do better on conversations, but never so much pressure as that.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I remember being in China sometime pre-pandemic and being at a factory and them dealing with having a power cut, I think twice a week. And when I was asking them about this, they were a bit cagey to begin with. But I think I asked the guy I was with who spoke Chinese, and he said, "Oh no, it's because they're not meeting the local responsibilities for being greener, and so they're being punished by having their power turned off." So that was must have been 6 years ago or something.
Right.
So that's interesting. That was the kind of first time I'd seen that, that sort of action.
It's definitely, if you're lucky enough to travel to see how things are made, it's definitely very eye-opening to see how it all works, right?
Yeah. Am I right in saying from a sort of corporate perspective that sustainability is these days is really sort of as mostly about carbon emissions reduction?
I would say it depends on the company. I think companies kind of pick and choose how they're going to go about it. Definitely when they have like LCA and a published report, they're going to go with those numbers, and that's definitely going to be carbon. Yeah. And, at a corporate level, you're going to be buying offsets, which aren't necessarily, fair sometimes to the numbers. It doesn't paint a complete picture. But I think some other companies lean into sustainability very broadly as kind of like, how they treat their employees or the communities around them, which is all very fair. I think that's kind of like the thing about sustainability. It's very, very broad, and it's much more kind of holistically how you're approaching the planet and people in the products that we're making. But I think companies pick and choose because they can. Yeah.
And I suppose the sustainability, if you take that to its conclusion, to be really sustainable, then you get to the point where we're talking more circularity.
Yeah, I think like circularity for me ties very directly to the circular economy, and of course there's like circular materials and all the smaller, closer loops that we can kind of get our hands around, but. Yeah, I think sustainability, like I said, like it's being considerate of people and planet, whereas circularity to me is an economic problem, and everything that we do definitely feeds into the linear economy. So how can we try to modify behaviors and products and the way we go about our business, right, for the circular economy?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I suppose in one way, circularity fits within sustainability, and in the other way, sustainability fits within circularity. But that's interesting.
I mean, I'm interested too from your perspective in consultancy. I'm sure there's a lot of knowledge. Teams bring in like their best efforts and there's proposals, but at the end of the day, a lot of times you may not even know what happens behind closed doors as far as like why things get cut or get to kind of defend, the sustainability things or circularity proposals you might have baked in. It'll just get lost somehow, somewhere.
Yeah, I think we've really started doing it more kind of quietly because we haven't had necessarily any sort of direct traction with clients, or not necessarily traction, but even a remit. We haven't really had necessarily a remit from clients to say, hey, we want to make this more sustainable, more circular. So we've certainly, that hasn't stopped us doing things quietly by thinking about materials and processes and where things are manufactured or how they are, or designing for durability or what have you. But I think things will change, from a
client perspective, but I sort of feel like it's just going to be legislation driven, really.
I think even as even consumers and even designers, and consultancies, I think there's obviously things we can do at a sort of relatively low level and behind the scenes to sort of chip away and make a difference.
It's still make an important difference, but it's really, in my mind, the way I'm seeing things, it seems like legislation is really what's gonna change things. I mean, there's this new California legislation about right to repair that nobody knows about, that was passed on the 1st of July. It came into effect on the 1st of July, but I don't know anybody who knows about it,
which is amazing. And in fact, as a business,
you can be fined up to $5,000 a day by not complying with that. But yet nobody knows about it.
So you would think that our
Clients would be more, thinking about that more and having us
consider design for repair
and part availability, maybe modularity, even with components to facilitate that. But and even things like using screws so you can actually take a product apart rather than clips where you're probably going to damage a product to take it apart.
So these are all things that we're starting to do just as a practice, as a consultancy, because we want to make a difference, but it's still not, we're still not seeing that from clients, which is I think is weird, really.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think it's weird. I think, there's a lot of legislation. I mean, we're lucky. We're in California. There's more here than other places in America. But it is interesting when you start talking to kind of like when you're in the weeds of production and you start talking about compliance, and there's people asking questions. It's like, well, is it California compliant? Is like different regionals, which come into consideration. I think that's great. I feel like maybe if you don't have a corporation that is very robust in how it looks at compliance and has like their own in-house like lawyers and regional kind of people who watchdog for that thing, then a lot gets through the cracks.
Yeah, there's not really a kind of information service for it any other way. I mean, I suppose when it's broader, when it's thinking about the European Union, obviously it's happening across
the European Union, and it's very much the public's very much behind it. Then everybody is really aware of, for the most part, kind of what's going on and how legislation is changing. They're seeing action in the just in the products that they're being sold. Whereas I think here, there are new right to repair laws in California, Minnesota, and New York, but it's still very sort of small scale, and the awareness isn't there, and because there's no sort of, the US is very different to Europe. There's not that kind of same social responsibility as there is in Europe. So yeah, I guess that, there's just very little awareness.
Yeah. I think maybe even when you look at kind of like smaller businesses or startups, which are, big in our area, there's even less chance that there's somebody on staff or who has the ability to kind of be like, hey, what about, this legislation or these rules? And no one's taking time to like really ask questions unless you have a very particular type of investor. There's even less kind of like safeguard, right?
Yeah, and actually, like startups is actually where you see the most interesting kind of use cases or business cases, I should say, for sustainable businesses and circular businesses, because they, to make to have a circular business model, you need to. There's no way to do it without having that as your corporate remit.
Yeah.
Because it's structural. It's that you have to change completely the way you operate as a business to have a circular business model where maybe you take
products back at the end of their life, and you're reusing the materials or the components within that product, and you're giving them a second life, or even just converting that raw material back into new products. That takes completely different. It's very it's no longer linear. It's not. Even if you're having, it's still even different to sending your phone back to somebody to harvest the electronics. This is, I think, a circular business model where you're actually taking the goods back yourself. That requires a completely structural change. Whereas I think sustainability in other forms, it's easier to do bits and pieces to make incremental
much more
changes.
Achievable if you don't plan on completely disrupting your business. And the larger your business and corporation or longer you've been in practice, the harder it is, right? Without taking kind of a body count to to your people and the way you kind of like make money, right?
Yeah, I've actually been surprised. I had expected by now to see a lot more products as a service being offered to consumers. I remember growing up, we had there's this kind of the concept of like radio rentals where you would. I remember in my early 20s as an apartment, sharing an apartment, we would rent a washing machine, we would rent a TV, rent a VCR. All these things we'd be renting, and those were, I imagine, the companies who were renting those out were probably selecting those products because they knew that they were reputable brands, durable. They were going to be durable. They didn't need much in the way of repair. And that's all been sort of designed out of products now. There's much more planned obsolescence. Things aren't designed to last, but I'm actually surprised that hasn't yet come back to the point where there aren't companies investing in a different strategy where they are building things to last, and they're building things to be more circular, where they are they're expecting those products to be in service for many, many more years than they are now, and offering that as like a washing machine, where you're paying per wash load. So as a consumer, you're paying per wash load rather than for the washing machine itself. I'm surprised that we're not really seeing that yet, or not much. On a much smaller scale we are, but
I think I remember like there being like trend reports pre-pandemic, maybe actually quite a bit pre-pandemic, so maybe 5 years before or more, just kind of on the uptick of the possibility of that, because I think IKEA did kind of like rent your whole apartment kind of model in a small sector of like the EU, right? As kind of like a test case, and people were, all the trend forecasting was like, well, so many people are moving urban, the youth are coming up, the buying power, but they're going to be in cities instead of being out like, in rural areas. So like, this is perfect for them. Other models like this would be successful, but I feel like I don't want to blame like social media and like consumption, but I think things got very, very fast. And then even faster consumption during the pandemic, because we didn't go out to shops. We were just like ordering from the phone, like what convenience can I get delivered directly to me in just a couple clicks. And, it went very quickly from 50% of the time you're in the store, 50% of the time you're on your laptop, then to like not even on a laptop anymore. It has to be bought like on the phone. It's just so fast that we consume that it's faster than you can even like rent something. You're buying something faster.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I wonder whether the pandemic kind of upset that trend, and we would have to kind of reset. I hadn't thought about that.
I mean, like I remember like single use like masks and everything too, and then plastics. I think there was a big push before, and a lot of places were regulating quite well, or pushing towards regulation on single-use plastic. But then, with pandemic, it was like, well, it's a health and safety issue now, so we can't really prevent people from using something that will keep them healthier.
Yeah.
If for less touching, more just kind of like if you have germs, you throw it away. But it did create like a lot of waste, right? All the masks, all the tests we threw away, and still all like kind of delivery plastics that we still consume.
Yeah, I think I'm right in saying that California's just banned plastic bags, like plastic grocery bags, and I think that's going to be from January, perhaps. Do you know about that?
I don't know. I feel like we've had like the slow kind of like adopted, like okay, you can have it, but you have to pay for it, right?
Right. But I think even the long-lasting bags, they've now been axed.
Yeah.
So I think possibly from January. I can't remember.
Yeah, I mean, I think as far as materials, that's where I'm supposed to be thinking. These days, it's a part of sustainability. It's definitely a part of circularity. I think circularity and sustainability are so massive. Like we talked about before, like the loops of circularity, right? So the further and further it goes away and the product goes back out away from the consumer and has to be repaired by somebody else, or they harvest it for their end material and reuse those materials, the less circular that kind of ends up being. But at the end of the day, circular materials are probably the most achievable or understandable thing for a lot of businesses to kind of plan for. It's still expensive though, right? And I think that's kind of a hard thing for any young business or a business that has a product that can't handle the margin of material.
Right.
I think when a lot of times we kind of got hung up on the sexy sounding things like, ocean plastics or all that kind of thing, or bioplastics. And of course, there's always changing kind of metrics on what we believe is the better answer. I think for me, it really depends on what you're making, because some things should be built to last as long as possible, and some things shouldn't, because it's just, you shouldn't. You're just going to end up with very long-lasting garbage, because no matter what, it's going to be thrown away. So I think being mindful of what you need from it, like the mechanical properties, sometimes recycled things can't be high content of recyclability or recycled material, because maybe it mechanically doesn't behave the same way anymore. So you're kind of making use of recyclable material, but you're making something that's going to be more prone to becoming garbage at the end of the day, which is usually not what we want to do. And then I think something that you talked about, like planning for kind of like, disassembly. And it's very, very important when we're thinking about holistically how we're making a product and what materials we're using. Is even if you use great materials, if you're bonding it to unlike material in a way that is difficult for a user or a recycler to use, it's just still going to become garbage, unless it's like very, very precious, like metals, right? That it's going to be lumped together. And, recycling isn't as smart as we like to think it is. A lot of times there's only like 4 in the US, or in California, there's like only 4 plastics that are kind of valuable that they even bother trying to recycle at mass. Like, here in the city, you've got like ecology and everything. They're really only looking for a couple of those numbers, on
and
the
those
plastics.
have to be easily separable from the waste stream. So I think there was
when we were talking about this on the panel, the San Francisco Design Week panel this summer, Ingvo was talking about how the recyclers have to disassemble things. They've got 10 seconds to disassemble something, which is no time at all. And so you're talking about pulling out that's not even to recycle the plastics, that's to get to the valuable material, the more valuable materials inside the products, like so the metals or the printed circuit boards or what have you. But it did make me wonder, whether we need, as designers and engineers of products, whether we need to think about those 10 seconds. Is how do we design for those 10 seconds?
Right.
How do we facilitate that disassembly in that really short space of time? Which is kind of, obviously we want
But we want, on the other hand, we want products to last a long time. So we don't want them to fall apart.
Right.
So, I think, and then there's the other side to that, which, as you say, there are very few plastics that actually are valuable enough to or easy enough to process to where they can be processed without impacting their performance as a material, as like HDPE or things like that, where they can be recycled more than other plastics, more than engineering plastics, like ABS perhaps. How that might change, but essentially without a market for those materials, without a demand for those materials, for people willing to pay the money for that recovery, there is no recycling, and there's way less recycling than people think there is. We put all our recycling in inverted commas in our blue bins or whatever, but so little of it is actually recycled.
Yeah, I remember we took like a Recology, like little seminar, and I don't remember if it was that or as like a different kind of like Bloomberg story or something like that. But it was looking at the changes in how we get rid of our recycling. So like, yeah, the market for it. We used to, of course, like ship it overseas, right. But at some point they were like, you're just like junking up.
It's just waste.
Yeah, you're junking up our countries with your stuff, and so they stopped. And I think it might have been pictures of our port even where Recology or somebody had done the processing and sorted it out, and there was just bales, like massive amounts of material that was recyclable, but there was no market.
Right.
It was just sitting there.
Nobody wants it.
Yeah. So yes, I think, when you are a CMF designer or a designer that has some material selection powers, especially if you're working at like a larger corporation, I think that's a great opportunity to be part of the market for recycled materials. Yeah. But I think it also definitely, it's not an easy answer. You need to know the give and take of the material, like what percentage are you using? Not that you shouldn't use it, but like how far can you go before you're going to, mechanically compromise something? Yeah. And how far can you go where you can still have the aesthetic you want? Because sometimes if you go very high contact, you're only going to get certain colors. You can't get the one that maybe you originally kind of like envisioned at the beginning. Right. But kind of knowing, I think that kind of give and take helps you. It's definitely easier to know things going in, already kind of pre-select, make your first proposals in that way so that you're not learning something late and then trying to like repropose something later. And they're like, but wait, you showed us a white one the first time. Why is it black now, right?
Yeah, talking about colors, I'm curious, I've and I don't know whether you know the answer to this question, but I've owned a bunch of Logitech products over the years, and in fact there's even one sitting in front of us here that is probably painted. It looks like it might have a paint finish at least. Do you know, I imagine that must be, that's not a great story from a sustainability perspective. Even if it's a water-based paint, there's still going to be byproducts from that paint process, and you're still dealing with chemicals at the end of the day and increase in energy usage. But on the other hand, I suppose it does allow you to use maybe a higher quantity of recycled material in your plastic moldings if you can cover it up. I'm wondering, did you come across that?
It depends. I would say, I don't know about the one we're staring at, but I think if I remember, a lot of times, and not just at Logitech, I know other places, when you make something, maybe the first run before you knew better was painted, right? And then there's a lot of effort internally to like reduce as once somebody realizes, and that's the thing business-wise that resonates, like, oh, we can do without that, added step and added cost, right? Maybe it's going to take a little bit more work and it's going to be harder to like make it nice on the line. It's going to take a little bit more conversations with like QC and our factories. But if you can reduce a line item, then people are much more excited to talk about that and not even remember really that it's like the more sustainable option. So yeah, definitely from food packaging to any recycled plastic, you're going to want to have it, uncoated if possible, because a lot of times colorant in the master batch, so in the material or afterwards, right, any kind of like finishing is going to compromise. Unless you really work with certain suppliers and make it kind of a given and willing to spend more on some coatings that maybe at the right percentage aren't going to foul the recycling stream, then most of the time it's garbage. Like the sorting will just like trash it.
These are the kind of conversations that we have here internally, and when we're looking at concepts, when we're designing products, looking at early concepts. And thinking about colors, obviously, if it's a darker material, darker plastic, it's easier to have a higher post-consumer recycled content. But also, in fact, we were discussing this yesterday. I think we were talking about whether a component could be metal versus plastic, and it's funny. Like I think. Sometime last year, I was thinking about this. It's like, if we make a metal component, it can be recycled much more easily than a plastic one, which is probably it's never going to be recycled. But in fact, the energy required to make that metal part in the first place, and then the energy required
to recycle it too.
To convert that back into a raw material is massive compared to making a plastic part. Even if you're throwing away that plastic part. The negative impact of that. So that's certainly a lesson that I've learned in the last year, even that actually it's better to make a plastic part than a metal part, unless you really need a metal part.
It's so hard, I know, and like it's always changing. I think the better choice always changes because they're always doing different. Like even if the material itself isn't changing, the way we manufacture. Or the optimization that certain vendors may have changes where like their energy consumption might be different. Maybe their grid is cleaner. Maybe their source and their output is just better over time. It changes all the time. It's very hard to stay on top of it. But I think if designers care to tap in, or businesses care to tap in to make use of recycled material, it's something you just kind of have to dedicate time to making sure regulations haven't changed and, vendors haven't changed, technology hasn't changed, the way we recycle hasn't changed. But we have to kind of change to survive in the future. So we better stay on top of it, right?
Yeah, and I think, that makes me think about that it's easy to make small differences, and that just a little bit of research on whatever part you're designing. Even if if you are in a consultancy, even if the client doesn't know that you're going to use this material versus that material, or we're going to make this design decision versus that, it doesn't require the buy-in of the stakeholders to make that decision. It can be small incremental changes that you make at a design level that can have actually massive impacts. Without doing life cycle analysis, you're not going to necessarily know quite how massive they are, but I think that's something we're trying to have the design team be aware of, have more awareness of. It's just these small step changes that are important, and then the more you do that, the more awareness there is generally as designers. So the more little chunks you can bite off and chew on, then the more prepared you are to do more of that on the next project.
Yeah, it's like you said, small incremental, but you'll get somewhere, and the knowledge lives not only with like the designers and the team, but hopefully whoever you're pitching to, even if they didn't accept pitch A the first time, the next time they hear it, they'll be like, oh well, we can maybe increase this part over here, or we can add this part that we didn't do last time, and it'll just continue to like evolve into better and better products and choices.
I'm curious about the work you're doing at the moment with the electric RV.
Yes.
And can you talk a little bit about the kind of work that you're doing there from a not necessarily a detailed point of view, but what are the challenges you're facing and that you're addressing from a top level?
I won't, unspecific and untied to the entity I already talked about. Right. But I think not only with an electrified RV, right, but in the whole EV space, and maybe even automotive broadly, because we are all friends, I think the push towards electrification, there's a big understanding of clean energy, or at least from the investor perspective. So when you're talking to startups in the space or people who are interested in funding kind of clean energy initiatives, because there's good metrics around it, and it seems kind of more achievable. You put money into this thing and it's gonna come out with these really huge changes. And that's true. It's true. But I think a lot of times on the way, you're so focused on the forest, you don't even see the tree in front of you. So there's a lot of little choices that I think get overrun because you already assume you have this huge pot of gold over here, that you're not making smart choices, very near term and close to you about kind of holistically what you're offering. So that's just, I mean, I don't want to sound bitter, but I feel like when we're trying to get recycled materials or kind of get some of that investor money into developing better materials or supporting other material startups in our spaces that are developing better materials or manufacturing methods, it's maybe not happening, right? Because everybody's so focused on kind of the clean energy story that a lot of the other stuff gets forgotten.
I'd love to dig into that more, but I know that I'd be putting in a position you probably wouldn't be able to talk about it. So
luckily we're not on camera. We're the faces, right? And just kind of
just cut that bit out.
No. I think there's lots of great stuff happening, but I think if somebody is, which I am, very face down and kind of the CMF of the immediate, there's of course things that are super interesting, and there's just this week, I think, or last week, California passed more regulation on fibers,
right?
Which is textile. And I think even in consumer electronics, small to large, where I'm at, people forget how much textile we use. And then at the end of the day, a lot of the textiles that we're using for technical textiles are, fossil based because they're synthetics. But when we talk about microplastics, not only our molding kind of litter, but a lot of it is fiber shed coming out of these textiles, and the dyes that go into the water consumption used, and then the shipping back and forth, because America doesn't really have very many mills anymore. A lot of the fibers are done one place, the yarn, then they're shipped someplace else, and the actual knitting or weaving of material, and then sometimes it's even again shipped again to be dyed, and then definitely shipped again for a cut and sew, and then shipped over here or wherever the DC is for it to go out. And if you're making a product out of it, it's going to be shipped again to a place where they're going to marry the fabric to the hardware bits. So there's a lot of the carbon impact is just transportation. So
that's a great illustration. That's just welcome to our industrialized world.
Right.
That's pretty scary. What can you? I'm not aware of that new California legislation. What's that?
I don't remember what it's called, but it just got passed. If you follow Fibershed on social media, there's a great Fibershed kind of outpost here in the Bay, and they post quite a bit about it. But there was new regulation coming. I think that Newsom just signed last week. And then, definitely I think something that maybe hopefully half the audience is aware of, that California also this past year has adopted the PFE. So the water repellency coatings regulations, which is kind of same formula as like Teflon back in the day. So high toxicity, forever chemicals, but California, I think New York State, and maybe one other, maybe Colorado, no, a couple other states, right? Maybe 5 total have banned now. But I think 2025 is when it's in effect in California, which is quite big because textiles are so large. Nobody's manufacturing just for like one state, right? So if a couple of us are doing it, then it affects like the entire like American market and what people can sell into it.
Yeah, and I think that's also why obviously European legislation can have a big impact over here as well.
Yeah,
for larger companies at least.
Yeah, and I think just like the awareness too. So like the more these things get talked about, and I already ding social media for like consumption culture, but like at least it spreads information. I think like if you start to get hooked into some of the creators that talk about sustainability, then hopefully your algorithm gets more and more of it, and you kind of get fed easily digestible bits like things about coatings and forever chemicals or fibers and microplastics and all that kind of thing. Because world's moving fast, but regulations are trying to keep up, I guess. At least California is doing some small part in that.
Yeah, I think
I mentioned this at the beginning that I think legislation is our friend here. I think it's nice to think that we have the power as consumers to change, but
at the end of the day, it's like the US, for instance, is such a massive consumer market that the consumer interest in actually making the percentage of consumer interest that's actually interested in making a change for themselves is really pretty tiny. So their buying power is really limited. So in terms of influencing manufacturers or corporations, so the impact is going to be pretty small. But I think what's great is that we are seeing all this legislation that's coming online, even if people don't know about it. that is going to force change, and that's great. I think we've got this tendency to think of legislation as being a bad thing, but I think with this subject, I think is vital, really. And then it also means we don't need to, as consumers, we're not taking that burden to make those decisions. And I mean, for that matter, as designers, it makes it a lot easier to have that conversation with clients, because it's like, well, we have to do this because there's legislation coming up that means you need to comply. Whereas having that conversation where it's like, well, we really should do this because it's better for the planet. It's like, well, I don't want to do that. I'm not interested.
I think that's definitely the key that I think we forget a lot of the time, is that the power at the end of the day is with the consumer. But a lot of times what we offer them, they can't afford in the best form. So I think the more we lean into regulations and that being as kind of the stick that corporations must obey in order to sell product, that will keep prices and product fair for everybody, even because otherwise luxury is sustainability, right? And only like the very rich will be able to afford something that is healthy, or just not leading to all of our ruin. I think, generationally, the youth are much more skeptical, right, of like politics. And we know why, but in regulations is very important for anybody who wants to kind of make sure that this turn happens for society, because I think that is really the power, because in the absence of the masses being able to push people with their money, then it's really regulation, which will force companies to offer it at a fair price. If you vote and you care, you got to push, get knowledgeable in the space, grassroots to your local congressperson to try and get them to get stuff into into law to make it happen. Because I think that's a lot more powerful end result than kind of your own personal like boycotts and choices, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Did we talk about it all? Did we solve it? Are we done?
I think we solved it, Courtney. I think that's it.
Brilliant. What an afternoon. Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Courtney.
Thank you for listening to Prism. Follow us on whipsaw.com or your favorite streaming platform, and we'll be back with more thought-provoking episodes soon.
Prism is hosted by Dan Harden, principal designer and CEO of Whipsaw. Produced by Saoirse Lewis, mix and sound design by Eric